Good day, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to do a 20-minute theater-style session on how to migrate Exchange mailbox permissions. We're trying this concept where, with events being mostly virtual, we're trying something new in this series. So thank you for attending. My name is Mike Weaver, and I'm one of the product owners here at Quadratech. Here at Quadratech, I oversee our tenant-to-tenant migration products, and I'm really excited today to talk about this topic. Before we get started, there are just a couple things to run through. For optimal listening for everyone, all lines are currently muted and will be throughout the webinar. If you have questions, feel free to send them in to us using the question feature on the right toolbar, and we'll be trying to handle all our Q&A. We might go over the 20 minutes when we do Q&A, depending on what we get, so stand by. The session is being recorded, and a link will be shared to all registered attendees in the next day or so. So thanks for joining. Just because I don't have very much time, just as a company, this is what we do here at Quadratech. In the center is what we're going to talk about today is our tenant-to-tenant migration tooling. But we also have a really robust set of migration products for moving legacy systems like Veritas Enterprise Vault and PST files into Office 365. And then on the far right, we've got our Nova management platform, which is for all sorts of reporting and analytics and getting control over your Office 365 environment. In a previous life, that was actually radar reporting and autopilot. But on to today's topic. So this is a question that I think all of us in the business get a lot, but do you migrate delegates? And it's a really interesting question because mailbox delegation really falls into these three categories. And so when people ask me, do you migrate delegates? Most are actually talking about all of this together. So in the first few slides, I'm just going to go through and talk about those three items, where they came from, and then we can talk about how the solutions and impacts for mergers and acquisition projects or tenant-to-tenant projects. So we talk about delegates. This is kind of the classic original method for sharing out a mailbox. This goes back to even the 5.5 days, I believe, where you could delegate down certain aspects of your mailbox. And this was a user-driven process. You can do it as an administrator as well, but for the most part, someone can log in and do it. And this is a really popular feature, particularly for execs or people that have their calendars being managed, or even if you go on vacation. Sometimes some companies have had policies where you delegate rights to somebody while you're out and then rescind it when you're back, whatever it may be. When we talk about the migration impacts, this is actually kind of complex. As you can see just on this screen, there's all sorts of different options, and capturing these options and ensuring that they're taken care of is really important for several reasons that we'll go into really across all these permission sets. So delegates, this is the user-driven process. Mainly the main piece is calendar function, but again, other aspects as well. I think this perhaps is when people think of mailbox access, the most popular and common, and this is full mailbox permissions. So these are today mainly shared mailboxes, but this could be a while back too, and just regular accounts that have been run forward, although most people have consumed these new functions and processes as shared mailboxes because of the pricing strategy that we have. But this is kind of the typical piece of giving full mailbox access. Again, shared mailboxes being one of them, and really three main access items, but there are all sorts of sub options that can be applied as well. But it's important, again, that these are captured and brought over. And what's important to note here is these are features where users will be able to see everything in that mailbox, and it has impacts to their Outlook profile. So this can be pretty impactful for migration as well. And last piece are folder permissions. And really this comes into two categories. We have calendar permissions, which are really just calendar folder permissions. And then we have our folder permissions. So on the far right is that calendar use case. So in Outlook 2013, we got that really nice wizard to make it easy to share. And users love it. I know I love it. It's very simple to just give out access very quickly and easily. Pulling it back may not be as easy, so that's a problem we'll talk about as well. And then on the far left, we've kind of got these other options and use cases. So folder level permissions can be in shared mailboxes, they can be in user mailboxes. Some have really created advanced workflows. So again, Exchange was that original collaboration tool for a lot of organizations. So some of these processes go back a very, very long time, where people have given all this different business process into shared folders. And again, for migration, that can be a really big impact. The other aspect can be me as a person may delegate down a certain folder to someone that I work for, or they work for me, and they drag items to my mailbox, whatever it may be. There's still a lot of that workforce workflow item out there. So we talk about all the delegation options. We really have these categories. So are they user or admin assigned? For delegates, it's both, although typically user driven. For full mailbox permissions, it's admin driven. That's not available to the user, and that actually makes it a little more complex because they can't audit it themselves. And folder level permissions, typically user driven, and admin could obviously open the mailbox, add themselves to have rights, open the mailbox and set it up, but usually that's user driven. The impact from a migration standpoint, delegates for VIPs, it's really impactful. Those are going to be those awful Monday morning panic calls. We talk about full mailbox permissions, still panic calls, but usually not your CFO, CEO, C-suite executives having a problem, but your customer service teams probably have a process involved in that, so that can be really problematic. And folder level permissions, same kind of impact, but very specialized. And what I mean by that is really niche. So if you have this problem, it's a big problem. If you don't, but the majority of people do not have that problem. We talk about shared or user mailboxes. That's where we talk about delegates are only user-driven processes. We don't usually have delegates on shared mailbox. Full mailbox permissions, it can be both, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute as well, but mainly shared. And then folder level permissions, it is both, again, mainly in the shared environment. From a migration standpoint, this is where it can be a little bit of a pain, and I guess why some of you, a lot of are here, is migrating these permissions isn't necessarily straightforward. So we'll talk again in a second here more on that, but how do you do it? Can you do it in PowerShell with delegates? You can, but you've got to guess a little bit. Full mailbox permissions, yep, absolutely, but you can only do it in PowerShell, so that has some other challenges. And then folder level permissions, you can a little bit. There's some features that have come out, but it can be quite difficult to actually do that effectively. So let's hop into what should we do. So we're going to spend a good amount of time on what should we do, and as most times it depends. So as a migration tool, we handle all of these, but what should be done is always more important. Most firms end up making a plan for the shared mailboxes separate from the user mailboxes, and that's just based on how they're used. There's a lot of wasted effort and issues that can arise. The most important thing when you're making a decision for your firm is to make data-driven decisions. Sample some of the users that are going, see how they're being used. One really helpful thing is to pull help desk documents in the source environment and see how the help desk is telling people how to do certain sharing. That can guide you on what's being used in your organization and what's not. The other aspect is interviewing power users. We always have some really loud, good users that are heavy users of our systems. So that's really always a great way to do it. I love doing end user interviews whenever I can for projects and gaining that insight. You also want to understand what's in your email. So if you're a highly regulated SEC controlled client, or or you're working in a highly regulated environment or industry, you're going to be really sensitive to those permissions. Whereas if you're in a different industry where certainly we care about data security, but if something goes wrong, it's not really a disclosure that we have to make to clients or something like that. So it's important to understand those aspects as well when you're making your determination. We talk about what you should do. Again, shared mailboxes, what is the documented process? So if there is every single option is available in the knowledge base for your help desk, well, then every single option is going to have to be planned for probably. But understanding what's used, and that's, again, talking to desktop support and other firms to figure it out. The biggest question for shared mailboxes is it up to date? In merger, acquisition, and divestiture work, you're typically moving from a less mature IT policy into a more mature policy. So organizations and the target may have these really strong mailbox audit procedures that they've gone through every year or twice a year, but your source environment may not have that level of detail, which raises two questions. One is, do I need to do that audit pre-migration? And the second is, should I be migrating all this stuff into my clean environment? And sometimes those are hand in hand. The other aspect of shared mailboxes is if you're using AutoMap. If you're not using AutoMap on the source and you're using it on the target, and you bring back everyone's mailboxes from 5 jobs ago, that can be a lot of items. But again, if you're regulated, that can bring up some questions around data exposure and what you should do. So they can give the illusion of a data event to users, even though they had that access all along. It's just now it's really in their face. So those are some things you really need to consider when you're making your shared mailbox decision. We talk about user mailboxes. One thing to keep in mind is, do you have a quote unquote loose shared mailbox policy? So we've run into several clients where when they really restrict, you can't have a shared mailbox, or it's really high cost to have a shared mailbox, whatever the barrier may be. All of us that have been in IT long enough, we know people will find a way around when their systems don't meet their needs. So we've actually found some really interesting use cases where the supervisor can have a larger mailbox, so they shared out space to their other employees, and people were throwing their mail in there. And so you've got these critical mailbox permissions. We can argue about the process another day. But again, it just brings home the point. You can have situations where the policies you have will push people to do certain things in their user mailbox instead of a shared mailbox, or the other way around. So you may find some in process that can be quite problematic. Are delegates used in your environment a lot? For a lot of our projects, we find they're either used or they're not. And so you may be able to say, okay, we maybe have an executive support team for our top 50 people that we support in our org. They're going to handle those with delegate permissions because they're really sensitive, and everyone else, we want you to start fresh. Or you may just say, now's the time to start fresh. We're concerned about data security. This is what we're going to do. So finding out if your access is up to date is an important aspect. What we see, quite honestly, is this mix in the market. So for the most part, we move full mailbox permissions for shared accounts because that process is really important. There's a caveat in the next slide here, though, for that. And for user accounts, we do delegates because they're really impactful. If somebody has delegate calendar processing, it's really important that we reset that up with the processing options so that the person can be effective on Monday morning. Just personally, as a migration administrator, that will get rid of some of your panic 8 a.m., 9 a.m. calls. So I do recommend doing delegates where you can. And again, in some cases, we'll migrate custom calendar permissions. That wizard I talked about is kind of a double-edged sword. The bad news is a lot of people are using it because it's easy. The other bad news is people don't clean it up. But the good news is it's really easy to set it up again. So that's a org by org decision. And so the first two definitely most common for us. That last one, depending what the environment needs and how long you've been on Exchange as well. We talk about challenges to migrating mailbox permissions. Stale permissions is the number one biggest problem. This has so many issues, not just from the process and what we're talking about here, but a lot of times if you're trying to make the decision if you're going to do a cutover migration or stage migration, we look at collaboration. So we look how people are working together, and activity data is a little hard to come by and make sense of. So we look at mailbox permissions. If they're out of date, you're worrying about all these lines and vectors and planning that are out of date, and you're wasting a lot of time, and you can also put the wrong person in the wrong wave if you're just looking at it. So stale permissions are kind of the really big thing here, but at an M&A, it's also difficult to take the time to look at that. We already talked about AutoMap, but that is something I really want to drive home. It really does need to be looked at. And again, the real problem is if you're using AutoMap in the target, but not using it in the source where the users are today, that can cause a lot of problem. A note on permissions for full mailbox permissions, you're also going to have some accounts that have access today that those processes may be going away. So we see a lot of dropped permissions even in the automation that we do, and that's by design. So compliance systems, maybe a compliance office, that may change to a new process in the new company. Backup systems, discovery permissions, whatever it may be, that will typically get dropped as they come over. But again, you want to ensure that there is a plan on how you're going to handle that new environment going forward. If you're doing a massive transformation, a note on that, be sure that your discovery system will scale correctly and you want to test those items. Highly customized permissions, when they're missed, is a very large problem. This is what breaks business processes. This is what prevents you from being able to service your customers. So mailbox permission seems like one of those simple things, but it actually can be extremely impactful when it's not done correctly in a migration. So you really want to plan for it. This is another one of those things to have, quick access documentation for your help desks, PDFs ready to go to send out to the user community. We've got a really good set of communication templates on our website where you can put these things in. These are some of the guides that you want to put into these communications. And then another challenge is AD groups providing access. So about 10 years ago, a lot of organizations started doing for shared mailboxes, AD groups provided access instead of directly the users. And that, for a lot of people, made it easier to audit permissions, but that can create other challenges because now you got to have an AD group in the target to match to. So now you've got to map the two together and you've got to move that membership. So that does add to the challenge. And then the other thing is domain moves and timing. So that right there can also be a challenge because you've got to do a translation between the two, and you've got to ensure that when you're doing your scripting that the users are currently at that piece. So that can add to the complexity that you have in doing the work. All right, so that is my quick session. I actually got it done in less than 20 minutes, so I hope that is effective and helpful. A nice little quick session. We do this as part of our migration tooling here with Cloud Commander. Everything runs off of a master mapping, and we've gotten really good at keeping this really running efficiently. And it's handled through automated workflow options. So if this is something that you're dealing with or have an upcoming project, certainly get in touch and we can talk to you about what we can do. We actually have done a lot of content on this as well for this webinar and for our KB to help educate our current clients and new clients like you. So we have put all of this into a great white paper as well, beyond even what we talked about in this webinar. So this is a really good guide. If it becomes popular, we'll keep doing version updates like we do with our other white papers. So if it's popular, we'll keep it upgraded and going. All right, I do have a question that came in. And of course, I'm I'm used to my team live events. So it is cut off. So we have a question from Jim, and Jim has a question about measuring the use of, and I think if I'm reading between the lines here, is how to determine the use of in doing an inventory. So some of this, to your point, and he actually mentions right here, mailbox audit logging, there are some options to do that. It can be quite difficult with homegrown scripts to look at those logs. I can try to find an article for you, Jim, off of, there was actually an article about 6 months ago on one of our partner sites on how to look at that audit data. The challenge can be if you're only looking at about 500 users, you can do it pretty easily with just looking at that data. When you get more than that, it can be really, really overwhelming. But for spot checking, that is definitely what I would be looking at is some of that mailbox audit logging. So you could spot check with some of the items that we have. So I'll work with our marketing team to get that article out for you. I'll hold just for a minute, see if any other questions come in. All right. If anything else comes in, feel free to use our contact us page. I'm happy to talk about this topic because it's really been a big challenge for our projects. Otherwise, I appreciate you checking in for our quick session. If you did like the 20-minute concept, you can let us know as well, and we'll keep some of these topics. Enjoy your day. Thank you very much.